In 2004, a spine-chilling miracle awakened from dusty files that had been dormant for 41 years. The 10-year-old girl who vanished without a trace in the heart of Michigan in 1963 was suddenly confirmed to be still alive, grown up, with a different life, and never knowing she had been buried in a cold case presumed to be a death. Just shortly before that, the truth hit like an unavoidable blow. For more than 4 decades. The entire system had believed Nancy Perez was dead, while she continued to exist, breathe, love, and live under a completely different identity. Her biological family had cried themselves dry, the investigation had stalled, witnesses had disappeared, and the case was shelved like an unsolvable tragedy of post-war America. Today, I will plunge you straight into the epicenter of a journey spanning nearly half a century, the moment the child disappeared, the deadly mistakes of the initial investigation, and how time concealed a truth no one dared believe. This is not just a kidnapping, this is a horrifying story of systemic failure, stolen identity, and a life drifting beyond the reach of justice. You are my most valuable companions. Take a deep breath, because right now, we are stepping into a story that will make you wonder how many dead children out there are actually still living without anyone knowing. Before diving deep into this shocking true case, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe justice should never be allowed to sleep, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Michigan in 1963 still carried the appearance of a peaceful land, where industrial towns blended with small residential areas operating at a slow and familiar pace, where children could walk alone through a few blocks without worrying adults, where front doors were often left unlocked during the day, and strangers were rarely viewed with suspicious eyes. In that context, the Perez family lived in an ordinary working-class neighborhood, unremarkable, not wealthy but stable, with days repeating according to work schedules, fixed dinner times, and neighbor relationships close enough to call each other by name. Mr. and Mrs. Perez were typical parents of that era, valuing discipline, hard work, and children's independence, believing that letting kids handle small daily tasks on their own was part of growing up. Nancy Perez, 10 years old, was the second child in the family, with a petite build, dark hair often tied neatly back, a face easily recognizable by her observant eyes, and habit of staying silent when unnecessary. A child not overly hyperactive, but curious enough to enjoy completing assigned tasks on her own. Nancy's bond with her family was most evident through her attachment to immediate relatives who interacted with her daily. Those who knew her schedule well, the route she usually took, the things she was allowed to do, and those she was reminded to avoid, and it was that familiar bond that made no one in the house think a normal day could slip out of control just because of a few minutes' delay. That morning unfolded like any other. Familiar routines carried out in the usual order. Nancy left home to do a small errand within what was considered a safe range. The familiar route not long, no prior signs of danger, and those around continued their work with the default trust that everything would proceed as usual. The first unusual element appeared not as a clear event, but as a very small offbeat detail, a moment that made witnesses briefly notice something unusual, but not enough to trigger a strong response. A strange presence in a familiar setting. Behavior not entirely fitting, but also not abnormal enough to break the deeply ingrained habit of trusting people in community life at that time. Human reaction to that detail followed the familiar chain of social psychology, from mild instinctive doubt to hesitation because they didn't want to blow up an unclear situation, then ending with self-reassurance that everything was probably fine, that kids sometimes run late, that there was no reason to assume the worst in a town that was peaceful. It was that chain of reactions that created the first time gap, a gap that later became the fragile boundary between a normal day and a disappearance. When Nancy did not appear at the expected destination, and did not return home at the usual time. Initially the family handled the delay with a waiting attitude, then shifted to worry, as familiar assumptions were ruled out one by one. Spontaneous searches were carried out instinctively by relatives, calling her name, asking neighbors, checking the familiar route, each action stemming from the belief that just searching a bit more thoroughly would find the child somewhere safe and unaware of the spreading panic. Initial witness information was collected in a rushed and uncertain state, each person remembering a different detail, no one daring to confirm what they saw was important, and that vagueness meant the overall picture could not form a clear anchor. As time continued to pass without Nancy appearing, emotions in the family shifted from worry to fear, from hope to panic, and finally to the realization they had to face that the situation had exceeded their ability to handle alone. The decision to report to the police was made not as a dramatic action, but as a last resort in a chain of unwilling choices, marking the moment Nancy Perez was officially recorded as a missing child, closing the fragile piece of a seemingly harmless day, and opening an unanswered void right from the first hours. The missing person report call was received in a context without clear urgent signs, when the Perez family, after many hours of fruitless self-searching, had to present to local police that their daughter had not returned according to her usual schedule, and could not be located by any familiar means. And right from that moment, the case was processed in the way law enforcement in 1963 still applied to cases of children absent for unknown reasons, a procedure more administrative than emergency response, in which initial information was recorded based on the family's account, the victim's age, estimated time since loss of contact, and subjective assessment of the likelihood the child left the area voluntarily. Case classification occurred almost simultaneously with receiving the report, and in this phase, Nancy Perez was viewed as a low-risk case by the standards of that time, because she had no history of running away, no signs of serious family conflict, no personal belongings left indicating preparation, and disappeared within a range considered safe, leading to the decision to place the case at medium priority, rather than highest urgency, a decision made not from indifference, but from a limited risk assessment system, where truly dangerous missing cases were often linked to evidence of violence, threats, or direct witnesses, confirming criminal acts. From this initial classification decision, the deployment of investigative forces was also affected, as only a few officers were assigned to handle the case in the early hours, with main tasks being verifying information, checking surrounding areas, and collecting additional statements, rather than immediately sealing off the scene or expanding the search beyond the local range. And this deployment occurred while the Perez family was in a state of panic, continuously providing more information, memories, assumptions, and suspicions, making the data filtering process difficult right from the start. The initial investigative force approached the area where Nancy was last seen with the goal of confirming no clear dangerous factors were overlooked, but what they faced was a space already disturbed by prior spontaneous search activities, traces covered by footsteps of relatives and neighbors, and no clear boundary between the area needing examination and the rest of the neighborhood, forcing every scene assessment to rely on indirect observation and inference, rather than specific physical evidence. This approach led to the initial conclusion that there were no signs of coercion or violence at the place. Nancy disappeared, no objects left unusually at that time, and no witnesses who could confirm seeing a criminal act occur, further reinforcing the assumption that this could be a case of a child getting lost or delayed, rather than an intentional kidnapping. And this conclusion directly influenced subsequent decisions in the early hours and days of the investigation. During situation assessment, investigators made some early decisions to shape the case handling direction, including focusing on verifying Nancy's familiar destinations, checking the routes she usually traveled, and inspecting nearby public places, while not yet expanding the investigation to possibilities involving strangers or organized crime. Because no factors at that time forced them to shift to the worst-case scenario. These early decisions, though reasonable by the standards and experience of that era, inadvertently placed the investigation on a narrow track, where initial assumptions became the reference frame for all subsequent actions, and every new piece of information was interpreted to fit this frame, rather than considered as a signal that might require adjusting the entire approach. While the investigative force carried out basic verification steps, the Perez family had to face the reality that the official process proceeded much slower than their pace of anxiety, as each passing hour without new information increased the feeling of helplessness, and the difference between the family's expectations and police handling began forming a psychological gap in which the family expected decisive and expansive action, while authorities operated according to standardized and cautious procedures. The initial police approach to the area where Nancy last appeared also revealed systemic limitations of the era, when there were no tools to quickly collect and analyze data on a wide scale, no centralized database to cross-reference similar cases, and no automatic mechanism for alerts or federal mobilization for cases not yet clearly defined in nature, making every decision dependent on subjective assessment by a few individuals in the early hours. These decisions, though made with the goal of efficient handling within allowed limits, created long-term consequences, as they established an initial investigative direction that was very difficult to reverse later, because once the case was shaped as a disappearance without signs of crime, resources, attention, and urgency level were all adjusted accordingly, and any vague or inconsistent information with this assumption was easily downplayed or dismissed. In that context, the investigation was activated not as an explosive response, but as a slow starting process, where each initial step, each seemingly small decision, quietly shaped how Nancy Perez's disappearance would be viewed, handled, and remembered in the law enforcement system, laying the foundation for a chain of events that at that time, no one could foresee the complexity and duration of. From the early decisions made in the first hours after receiving the report, the investigative force began shifting focus to observing and assessing the scene, in a way fitting the initial assumption that Nancy Perez might have moved away from the familiar range without serious incident, and this approach directly influenced determining what constituted the scene to be examined, because there was no specific location with clear crime signs, but only a large area where Nancy was believed to have appeared last, including the route she usually took, nearby public spaces, and familiar stops in daily activities. Scene observation occurred under less than ideal conditions, as this area had gone through many hours impacted by spontaneous search activities of family and neighbors, causing potential traces to be blurred or mixed, and the lack of immediate sealing meant no clear boundary between the space needing preservation and the rest of the neighborhood, forcing investigators to rely mainly on indirect descriptions and logical inference, rather than physical evidence. During assessment, they noted no signs of unusual disturbance, no objects left in a way indicating coercion, and no clear traces of a struggle or violent act. These observations further reinforcing the view that the scene did not carry characteristics of a kidnapping as commonly understood at that time, while making establishing the initial investigative range difficult, because there was no specific marker to narrow or expand the focused area. The investigative range was thus determined, based on Nancy's daily habits and accounts from those around her, including routes she often used, public places within walking distance, and spots she might stop by during the day, but this determination was more speculative than evidence-based conclusion, leading to a range both too broad to control effectively, and too narrow to cover possibilities outside familiar habits. Parallel to assessing physical space, the investigative force began collecting information to build an initial timeline for the day Nancy disappeared, a task that seemed simple but quickly revealed complexity when information sources were inconsistent and entirely dependent on human memory. From the family's account of when Nancy left home, to unofficial reports from neighbors or passers-by claiming they might have seen her at different times during the day. Building the timeline occurred by piecing together estimated time points, each carrying a certain degree of uncertainty, and from the start there were gaps that could not be filled, periods where no one could confirm where Nancy was, what she was doing, or which direction she moved, creating a blurred zone extending from the moment she left relative sight until the disappearance was discovered. These gaps not only reflected information limitations, but also showed the investigation's degree of dependence on the assumption that everything occurred within the familiar range, because without specific data to challenge that assumption, the gaps were easily seen as consequences of imperfect memory, rather than signals of an unusual event. While the timeline continued to be adjusted with each new statement, the scene still suffered uncontrolled impacts, as residents continued passing through, searching, and even cleaning areas they deemed unrelated, unintentionally losing the ability to collect physical evidence, if it existed, and the lack of clear sealing procedures meant no one could precisely determine when the scene no longer retained its initial state. The investigative force recognized these limitations but lacked tools or authority to reverse the situation, because at that time, mobilizing additional resources or applying scene preservation measures was only done when there were clear crime signs, and in this case, all observations pointed to a vague picture, where no detail was strong enough to change the initial approach. The process of collecting information to build the timeline thus became a loop of recording, comparing, and adjusting, as each new statement both added a piece and disrupted the temporary structure already established. And the more information collected, the overall picture became more chaotic rather than clearer. The unexplained time gaps continued to exist like blind spots in the file, but instead of being viewed as the focus needing resolution, they gradually became accepted as unavoidable consequences of a case lacking direct evidence, and this acceptance caused investigative efforts to focus more on confirming what was already known, rather than pursuing what was unknown. In that context, the scene was no longer viewed as a living source of information, but gradually became an abstract concept, described through accounts and hand-drawn diagrams rather than physical traces, and each passing hour not only increased family anxiety, but also reduced the ability to accurately reconstruct what happened in the critical time period. The uncontrolled impacts on the scene combined with unexplained timeline gaps created a fragile investigative foundation, where all conclusions relied on assumptions and inference. And this foundation would continue to influence how Nancy Perez's disappearance was handled in subsequent phases, as new decisions were made based on an initial picture that was already incomplete. The inability to establish a clear crime scene, combined with increasingly large gaps in the initial timeline, forced the investigation to shift its focus to the only remaining exploitable data source, what people remembered and believed they had seen. From this point onward, the memories of witnesses became the primary foundation for reconstructing the events leading to Nancy Perez's disappearance. Direct witness interviews were conducted with the expectation of finding a solid anchor point, a moment or action that could pin down the chain of events, but the earliest individuals approached could only provide approximate descriptions reliant on personal perceptions of time and space, rendering all collected information lacking the precision needed to play a decisive role. Alongside the direct witnesses, investigators expanded their reach to indirect witnesses, people who had no clear interaction with Nancy, but believed they had seen a child resembling her in the area on the same day. It was this group of statements that began to create a web of overlapping information, where details not only differed, but contradicted one another regarding direction of movement, location of appearance, and estimated time frames. In the process of compilation, contradictions became unavoidable, not because witnesses were deliberately falsifying, but because human memory is not designed to accurately retain ordinary events, especially details that were not considered important at the time they occurred, leading each individual to unconsciously add, omit, or restructure their memories when attempting to answer investigative questions. The psychological pressure of being involved in a child disappearance case also strongly influenced how witnesses recalled events, some began doubting their own reliability and repeatedly adjusted their accounts to align with what they heard from others, while others became overly confident in details they believed they had observed, even though they could not be corroborated by any objective evidence. The influence of the social environment further complicated the issue, as stories circulating in the community, local media, and everyday conversations quickly seeped into personal memories, blurring the line between direct experience and second-hand information. This posed a major challenge for investigators in distinguishing original memories from those that had been reshaped. Repeated interviews with the same witnesses clearly revealed how memories evolved over time. Details initially mentioned with hesitation gradually became clearer in later retellings, not because they were actually more accurate, but because the narrator had unconsciously constructed a coherent story to fill uncomfortable gaps in their recollection. In this context, assessing the reliability of each statement became a mental balancing act, requiring equilibrium between not overlooking any potential information and avoiding letting uncertain details derail the entire investigation. The accumulating contradictions in statements forced continual adjustments to the initial timeline, with each change disrupting other time markers and creating a flexible but unstable temporal structure where gaps were not narrowed but merely shifted, making it increasingly difficult to pinpoint the exact sequence of events. The growing reliance on witness memories also exposed the limits of investigative methods in the absence of physical evidence. Each new statement was seen both as an opportunity to clarify the case and as a risk of increasing informational noise, forcing investigators to constantly sift, cross-check, and discard unverifiable details. Adjusting the timeline based on statements was not just a technical operation, but also reflected how initial assumptions continued to dominate information interpretation. Accounts fitting the emerging investigative direction were often deemed more reasonable, while details contradicting assumptions were easily categorized as unreliable, even without full analysis. The outcome of this phase was an investigative file built primarily from fragmented memories, heavily influenced by human psychology, where objective truth was hard to separate from subjective perception. This fragile foundation would continue to impact every subsequent decision in the investigation, as each new step relied on an ever-changing timeline and a set of statements that never achieved absolute consensus. The instability of the witness statement-based timeline meant investigators could no longer simply sit in interview rooms waiting for human memories to reorganize themselves. The focus therefore shifted to field search operations, in the hope that the physical environment still held objective traces that could compensate for the uncertainty of accounts, a decision that led to coordinated searches involving police, the family, and the local community, with each group bringing different motivations, but sharing the common desire to quickly locate Nancy Perez. The search activities were deployed in a manner reflecting the conditions and investigative mindset of the era, mobilizing neighbors, community organizations, and volunteers familiar with the area, who believed their local knowledge could provide an advantage, while police maintained basic coordination, focusing on assigning search zones rather than applying a specialized strategy. The initial search radius was determined based on Nancy's daily habits and destinations considered within her range of movement, including familiar paths, public spaces, open areas, and places a child might curiously visit. However, this approach was linear and assumed Nancy remained nearby, without considering the possibility she could have been removed from the area early on. Searching nearby zones occurred without detailed maps or positioning technology, making all efforts dependent on participants' diligence and memory. With a large number of volunteers, controlling search quality became a challenge. It was impossible to confirm which areas had been thoroughly checked and which had only been skimmed. During this process, some personal items believed related to Nancy were discovered. Though there was no clear evidence tying them directly to the disappearance, the appearance of familiar objects immediately drew attention from both the family and investigators, as they provided a sense that the search had finally touched a concrete anchor rather than continuing to float in assumptions. These personal items were collected and documented according to procedures of the time, but evaluating their evidentiary value faced limitations. There were no signs they had been discarded under duress, no way to precisely determine when they appeared at the discovery site, and no analytical tools to extract additional information beyond visual observation. Investigators had to weigh whether to treat these finds as significant clues or merely coincidental elements unrelated to the disappearance, a consideration heavily influenced by the initial assumption of a lost child, making the items more likely interpreted as traces of voluntary wandering than signs of criminal activity. Alongside physical evidence evaluation, search teams continued expanding to farther areas, but each expansion dispersed resources and heightened participant fatigue as time passed without concrete results, eroding morale and search effectiveness. In this context, the lack of a clear criminal hypothesis meant searches lacked consistent focus, simultaneously considering Nancy wandering off, suffering an accident, or being led away without clear traces. This lack of direction made it hard to place discoveries within a coherent analytical framework. Evidence evaluation was thus cautious and reserved. Each item or trace was assessed not only on its own merits, but also on how well it fit existing assumptions, with elements not reinforcing the dominant hypothesis easily deemed unimportant for changing direction. While the Perez family saw hope in every discovery that Nancy was nearby and findable, investigators faced the responsibility of distinguishing emotional hope from realistic probability, a thin line placing heavy pressure on decisions from both public and internal sources. This difference sometimes led to underlying tension between the family and investigators. The family wanted unrestricted expansion regardless of cost or hypothesis, while authorities had to weigh feasibility and efficiency, without evidence pointing to a specific criminal direction. Failure to confirm a criminal direction, after initial searches and discoveries, gradually reinforced the view that the case might not involve violence or intentional abduction, a reasonable assessment based on collected data, but one that also narrowed thinking about other possibilities. As search teams continued with diminishing intensity, the investigative file accumulated notes on searched areas, collected items, and evidence evaluations, forming a detailed but indecisive picture, lacking a breakthrough discovery strong enough to force a directional shift. The prolongation of the search phase without breakthroughs gradually shifted activities from urgent to sustained, reflecting an implicit adjustment in expectations for both community and investigators. Initial hope replaced by continued effort, while accepting that finding Nancy under current conditions was becoming increasingly unlikely. In this context, the initial discoveries, carefully documented, were insufficient to conclusively confirm or rule out any scenario, and the absence of a clear criminal direction became the key factor shaping the investigation's progression. Every subsequent step built on limited physical evidence, ununified hypotheses, and time gradually fading both traces and public attention. The inability to confirm a specific criminal direction, after initial searches and discoveries, forced the investigation into a phase of shaping assumptions, where what had not been found began to influence outcomes as much as what had been recorded. From this point, dominant assumptions gradually formed as a way to reorganize the existing fragmented information in the file. These assumptions did not emerge randomly, but were built on prior observations: no signs of violence at the scene, no direct witnesses confirming coercion, no items discarded, suggesting struggle, and no search discoveries strong enough to shift to a serious crime scenario. This led to prioritizing possibilities like the child wandering off, getting lost, or suffering a local accident in investigative thinking. Within this assumption structure, abduction was not entirely ruled out, but relegated to secondary status, not because it was deemed impossible, but because it lacked elements that era's investigative mindset considered mandatory, such as threats, ransom demands, or witnesses seeing clear suspicious behavior. The absence of these made abduction seem remote, insufficient to dominate resource allocation. Era-specific investigative bias, played a key role in reinforcing these assumptions. Child abductions by strangers were not yet recognized as common or patterned, and societal perception tied such crimes more to unstable families or internal disputes than random external threats, naturally tilting investigators toward scenarios matching their familiar experience and statistics. This bias influenced not only probability assessments, but also how new information was received and interpreted. Data fitting dominant assumptions were readily noted and integrated, while contradictory details or those suggesting alternatives were often seen as insufficiently certain or too speculative to alter approach. The narrowing of investigative scope occurred gradually but consistently. Search areas limited to local zones, expansions beyond town, or involving unknown strangers deprioritized, and resources reallocated to higher probability scenarios per internal evaluation. This narrowing provided a sense of control and order. A smaller scope meant better detailed tracking and handling, but it also risked overlooking possibilities outside the established framework, especially in a case whose true nature remained undetermined. In this context, new approaches, ideas, or untested hypotheses appeared less frequently in internal discussions, not because they did not exist, but because they struggled for support without concrete evidence to challenge prevailing assumptions, and pursuing them risked being seen as resource diversion or complicating an already unclear file. The decline in new approaches also reflected invisible pressure on investigators. Each passing day without breakthrough heightened expectations for a reasonable conclusion, even if not correct, to avoid prolonged suspension. In this process, initial assumptions shifted from temporary tools to rigid foundations for subsequent decisions, not only directing actions, but influencing file presentation, information recording, and participants' understanding of the case. This change occurred quietly, but profoundly. Once assumptions became thinking templates, questioning them grew harder, especially without strong new data forcing reconsideration. The result was an investigation becoming more defensive than exploratory, focused on confirming believed truths rather than seeking unconsidered possibilities, with each narrowing decision raising psychological and organizational costs for reversal if contradictory information later emerged. While the Perez family clung to hope that all possibilities were being considered, the file increasingly reflected a different reality. Dominant assumptions shaping the view of Nancy Perez's disappearance, with all new information evaluated through that lens. The decline in new approaches did not mean the investigation ended, but it signaled a critical transitional phase, the pursuit of truth increasingly constrained by frameworks built for order amid chaos. These frameworks, providing short-term progress, laid the groundwork for prolonged stalemate, where answers grew harder as the range of permissible questions narrowed. The narrowing of the investigative scope and the dominance of the leading assumptions made the next step almost inevitable, shifting focus to screening individuals rather than spaces, with the goal of finding a person who could be fitted into the existing picture without disrupting the established thought structure. From there, a list of suspects began to be built based on the degree of access to Nancy Perez in daily life, as well as the possibility of being present in the area at the time she disappeared. The first group examined was strangers mentioned in witness statements, including individuals not from the local community, but believed to have appeared in the vicinity in the days prior. However, screening this group encountered difficulties from the start, as descriptions were vague and inconsistent regarding appearance, vehicles, or direction of movement, and there was no database or identification tools for quick cross-referencing, making all verification efforts dependent on the unreliable memory of informants. Concurrently, investigators turned their attention to temporary workers, those employed short-term at construction sites, factories, or services in the area, since they were unfamiliar enough not to draw close community scrutiny yet capable of leaving without a trace. But screening this group also quickly revealed limitations, as employment records were incomplete, residency registration was lax, and constant movement made it impossible to pinpoint exactly who was present at the critical time. During the process, some individuals were added to watch lists based on coincidences in timing or location, but interrogations yielded no information strong enough to elevate them from persons of interest to actual suspects, and the absence of physical evidence or corroborating testimony meant no suspicions could cross the legal threshold required for coercive measures. When approaches involving strangers and temporary workers yielded no concrete results, the investigative focus gradually shifted toward acquaintances of the Perez family, individuals with direct or indirect connections to Nancy who were presumed to know her daily routines, a direction consistent with the investigative bias of the era, when child-related cases were more often linked to familiar environments than random external threats. Screening of acquaintances was conducted more thoroughly, with repeated interviews, cross-checking of schedules, and examination of social relationships, but outcomes remained confined to intuitive suspicion, as no one had a clear motive, no one exhibited sufficiently serious abnormal behavior, and no evidence directly linked them to Nancy's disappearance. The lack of forensic evidence became the greatest barrier in this phase, as any suspicion, no matter how reasonable in investigative thinking, could not translate into concrete action without meeting proof standards, and in a context with no physical traces, no direct witnesses, and no confession, potential suspects were quietly removed from the list one by one. This elimination process produced no breakthrough, only a gradual narrowing of options, leaving an ever-widening gap between the need for answers and the practical capabilities of the investigative system, and each name crossed off the list reinforced the sense that the case was moving closer to a dead end rather than the truth. Within the investigative team, the repeated screening of suspects without tangible results began to generate fatigue and doubt, as initial assumptions were neither challenged by new evidence nor confirmed, leaving the file in a suspended state, not enough basis to close it but no clear direction to continue. The already scarce leads continued to dwindle over time. As new information failed to emerge, witnesses became harder to reach, and community memory began to fade, reducing the ability to gather additional data. In that context, every supplementary investigative effort had to confront questions of efficiency and justification, given limited resources and pressure from other cases demanding priority, making the decision to persist with a file showing no clear progress increasingly difficult. The depletion of leads did not happen abruptly, but as a prolonged process, where each investigative avenue successively reached its natural limit, and the failure to identify a suspect legally viable for prosecution caused the case to gradually lose its internal momentum. For the Perez family, this phase felt like a series of hopes repeatedly dashed, as each notification of a new suspect ended in silence or explanations that there was insufficient basis to proceed, heightening feelings of helplessness and suspicion that the case was slipping from the system's attention. From the investigative perspective, screening strangers, temporary workers and family acquaintances without decisive results reinforced the conclusion that no clear subject fit the existing assumptions, and when those assumptions no longer generated new avenues of action, they began to lose practical value. It was at this point that the investigation entered a state of functional stagnation, where all familiar paths had been exhausted without reaching a destination, and the lack of forensic evidence not only blocked action, but paralyzed the ability to pose new questions, signaling that Nancy Perez's disappearance was approaching a threshold where continued investigation was based not on progress, but on mere persistence, ushering in a phase where the dead end was no longer a temporary possibility, but the defining characteristic of the entire file. The prolonged stagnation after the various suspect screening avenues successively reached their natural limits, forced investigators to confront an increasingly undeniable reality. There were no reliable signs that Nancy Perez was still alive within the framework of the assumptions and data collected, and the complete absence of new information over a sufficient period caused the file to shift gradually from a state of awaiting a breakthrough to one of reassessing the feasibility of continuation. In the overall review process, factors once seen as faint hopes successively lost value, as there was no evidence confirming Nancy's existence after the disappearance, no credible sightings, no indirect contacts, and no physical discoveries, allowing inference that she had moved beyond the initial area in a traceable way, making the possibility of the victim being alive an increasingly weak hypothesis in internal deliberations. The decision to shift the file's status to presumed deceased was not made as a definitive declaration, but as an administrative adjustment reflecting the case's probability assessment in the absence of new data, a decision both pragmatic for the investigative system and profoundly psychological for the family, as it marked an official change in how authorities viewed Nancy's fate. Applying presumed deceased status meant the investigative objective no longer focused on searching for a living victim, but shifted to archiving and preserving the file for possible future review if conditions allowed, and this change entailed a significant reduction in field activities, ending periodic searches and reallocating resources to other cases deemed more urgent. The formal investigation did not stop with a clear public announcement, but through a gradual decline in activity. As internal meetings became infrequent, update reports were no longer produced regularly, and names once on suspect lists were no longer mentioned, creating a silent conclusion rather than a distinct endpoint. The case file was transferred to storage per standard procedure, with documents organized, numbered, and shelved alongside hundreds of other unsolved files, and from that point, Nancy Perez's disappearance existed in the system primarily as a collection of paperwork, where all prior efforts were frozen in an incomplete state, awaiting an external factor that might revive interest. Archiving the file held technical meaning for the system, but symbolic meaning for the family, as it meant they no longer received periodic updates, no longer heard about progress or new investigative directions, and no longer felt their child's case was being actively handled, creating a prolonged information void without a clear endpoint. In this phase, all contact between the Perez family and investigators became sparse and formal, as family inquiries typically received only vague responses about no new information, reinforcing the sense that the case had been placed among files no longer capable of progress under current conditions. This shift not only reflected the limits of the specific investigation, but also illustrated how the system handled cases that did not fit familiar patterns, where the absence of evidence led not to a clear conclusion, but to a frozen state, and over time, that state was accepted as a default outcome. For investigators, classifying the case as cold allowed them to close a resource-intensive work cycle that had yielded no commensurate results, while freeing capacity for other cases, but it also meant acknowledging that prior assumptions, methods, and decisions had been insufficient to uncover the truth. For the Perez family, the change in file status created an invisible boundary between active searching and a new phase, where hope was no longer sustained by official action, but existed only as unconfirmed personal belief, and the lack of investigative updates forced them to confront questions about Nancy's fate without system support. The prolonged silence from authorities gradually became part of family life, as days passed without new information, turning the disappearance from an ongoing event into a painful unresolved memory, and the absence of official updates heightened feelings of abandonment, as if Nancy's story had been shelved along with other files in storage. The cold case status was thus not merely a classification label, but a structural turning point in how the case existed, shifting from an active investigative process to a static entity that could only be reactivated by factors outside the system's normal orbit, and at that time, there were no signs such conditions would arise. The quiet end of the active investigative phase left a procedurally complete but answerless file, where all prior efforts were documented but did not crystallize into a conclusion, and this very state laid the foundation for Nancy Perez's case to persist for years to come, as a typical cold case, not due to lack of initial concern, but because of the chain of decisions, assumptions, and limitations that led to a point where the system could no longer advance on its own. The cold case status froze Nancy Perez's disappearance in the system as a motionless file, but that silence existed only in Michigan, because in another space, beyond the geographic scope and investigative mindset previously formed, the victim's life continued along a completely separate trajectory, where Nancy no longer existed as a missing child, but gradually grew up in another state, under a new identity shaped by circumstances rather than personal choice. The change in living environment not only created geographic distance, but severed all administrative, social and psychological ties to the place she had vanished from, leaving the identity tied to the old case with no foothold to continue existing in her daily reality. In the new context, Nancy was called by a different name, one that carried no history, evoked no collective memory, and was not linked to any missing person file, and that very simplicity allowed the new identity to be accepted naturally in the community where she lived. This identity was not constructed as a complete entity from the start, but developed gradually according to life's needs, with each stage of maturity adding just enough information to function in society, from attending school and receiving medical care to participating in basic community activities, while core elements related to biological origins or early history were never formally established. The personal records tied to the new identity were thus patchwork, valid enough not to be rejected, but not complete enough to tell a full story, and this shortfall raised no questions in an era when civil management systems operated decentralized, relied on local declarations, and lacked federal cross-checking mechanisms to detect anomalies across states. Lacking a complete record did not mean being seen as abnormal, because in practice, many individuals moved between states with minimal paperwork, and as long as basic information showed no glaring contradictions, the system had no incentive to probe deeper, especially when the identity bearer generated no legal issues or special assistance requests. In the new environment, Nancy learned to exist within the framework of the identity assigned to her, not through conscious concealment of the past, but through passive adaptation to what was considered normal, as all social relationships, from school to the surrounding community, confirmed the person she was presented as, creating a reinforcing loop where the new identity grew increasingly solid. Nancy's daily life unfolded without any reference to the old case, without questions about where she had been or whom she belonged to, and without signs that a missing person file lay dormant in another state's storage. This separation was not only a result of geographic distance, but a consequence of systemic fragmentation, where civil, educational, and health databases operated independently, not designed to identify cases of discontinuous identity, especially when those cases created no clear conflict with existing information. Over time, Nancy's new identity ceased to be a temporary shell and became the foundation for her entire life experience, from how she viewed herself to how others viewed her, and each passing year without external intervention further reduced the likelihood of that identity being questioned. Any gaps in personal records, if they ever existed as points of ambiguity, were gradually filled by a continuous chain of experiences, where milestones of maturity, social relationships, and personal responsibilities replaced the need to trace origins, causing the lost past to no longer play a central role in shaping the present. The administrative management system, built on the assumption that existing records fully reflected reality, continued to operate without detecting the mismatch between a living individual and a case presumed closed, and this lack of integration created a prolonged blind spot where a person could exist legally without being cross-referenced against any missing person file outside their state of residence. Living detached from the old case also carried deep psychological meaning, as Nancy developed her personal identity based on current circumstances, without confirmed memories of her biological family or the community she once belonged to, and any feelings of displacement, if they arose, were explained by ordinary life reasons, rather than recognized as signs of a fractured history. The surrounding social relationships continuously validated the new identity, as friends, teachers, and colleagues all interacted with Nancy based on the same origin story, creating a consensual reality where no one had reason to doubt what had been accepted from the beginning. The outward stability of this life meant Nancy did not become the focus of any monitoring mechanism, as systems are typically triggered by anomalies, while she committed no crimes, required no special identity verification, and did not appear in situations requiring federal record cross-checking. Not being detected by the system thus stemmed not from sophistication, but from a perfect alignment between a sufficiently valid identity and a system not designed to search for what it did not expect to exist. Over the years, the new identity became the anchor for all personal decisions, from educational choices and work to intimate relationships, and the old case in Michigan, if it ever existed as an abstract possibility in her history, had no place in a real life built on the present and near future. The parallel existence between a living person and a missing victim presumed deceased created a paradox that lasted decades, where two entities shared an origin, but never intersected, due to a lack of both motivation and mechanism to connect them. That very paradox reflected the limits of investigative and civil management systems in the era before modern technology, when identity verification relied more on context and surface consistency than on tracing biological origins. Throughout this period, Nancy's life under a different identity continued relatively quietly, uninterrupted by the unresolved past, and that quietness, while providing personal stability, simultaneously prolonged the unresolved state of the case, as the victim existed beyond the reach of the system that had once tried to find her. It was this complete separation between current life and the old case that allowed a story considered closed on paper to persist in reality, as a parallel stream, where the victim did not know she was the center of a cold file, and the system did not know that the person they had stopped searching for was in fact still living, growing, and integrating elsewhere, entirely outside the view of the assumptions that had once framed her fate. The new identity not only shaped how Nancy existed within the administrative system, but also permeated every detail of the childhood she experienced in the new environment, where school life became the primary space for her to learn how to adapt to the role assigned to her. A role that carried no fractured past, but was presented as a normal starting point among other children. In school, Nancy appeared like any other student, attending classes, following discipline, and gradually blending into the shared rhythm of daily activities, where questions about origins or family history were rarely asked directly, and if they arose, they were usually brushed aside with simple answers sufficient to satisfy the fleeting curiosity of friends and teachers. The local education system accepted Nancy based on the minimal necessary paperwork, without requiring deep cross-verification of her past, and this acceptance created an outward sense of stability, allowing her to focus on academic and social activities without confronting the gaps in her personal records. Alongside the school environment, the substitute family played a central role in shaping Nancy's childhood experience, providing her with a daily routine framework, behavioral rules, and the necessary sense of belonging to survive in the new community, even though this relationship was built on a foundation incomplete in terms of blood ties. Within that family structure, Nancy learned to meet the expectations of her caregivers, adjusting her behavior and emotions to fit the surrounding context, and this very process promoted rapid adaptation, as asking too many questions about herself or her living circumstances was not encouraged. directly or indirectly. The adaptation process occurred not as a sudden shift, but as a series of small adjustments, where each day passing without major obstacles reinforced the belief that what existed was normal and did not need to be questioned, and that normality became a psychological shield, helping Nancy navigate the vague feelings that might emerge when facing unnamed differences. In that context, the avoidance of questions about origins did not stem from a lack of curiosity, but from a self-protection mechanism, as difficult questions could lead to unsatisfactory answers in an environment that did not encourage digging deeper, and accepting what was given became the least conflictual path to maintaining emotional stability. The school and the substitute family, each in its own way, contributed to sustaining this state by focusing on the present and near future, on academic performance, behavior and social integration, rather than encouraging the pursuit of the past. And this tacit agreement created a space where Nancy could grow up without constant reminders of what had been lost. The separation from the past gradually became a structural feature of daily life, as memories of the time before the new identity was formed, if they still existed, had no opportunity to be confirmed or reinforced, leading to their fading over time and being replaced by new experiences that were more continuous and consistent. In school activities, Nancy learned to build friendships based on the present, sharing stories aligned with her new identity, and avoiding topics that might reveal inconsistencies, a social skill not directly taught but formed through observation and feedback from the surrounding environment. The substitute family, even if not actively concealing information, still created a structure where questions about origins were not placed at the center, and this silence, over time, became part of the daily routine, causing Nancy to learn not to delve into what was not spoken about. The adaptation process was thus not merely outward integration, but also internal adjustment, as she learned to arrange her emotions to fit her current role, avoiding conflict and maintaining a sense of security in an environment where stability depended on not disturbing the existing assumptions. This stability, while providing immediate benefits, simultaneously reinforced the separation from the past, as each passing year without major events reduced the ability to connect the current person with the child who had once disappeared in Michigan, creating a psychological distance increasingly difficult to bridge. In the eyes of those around her, Nancy was perceived as an individual with a seamless history, a student with ordinary achievements and challenges, and this very perception fed back, helping her solidify her new identity, without needing to compare it to any other narrative. The absence of questions about origins was not only a result of the environment, but also an effective adaptation strategy, as accepting what was given allowed Nancy to focus on surviving and developing in the present, rather than facing inexplicable voids. Over time, the disrupted childhood was no longer felt as a clear loss, but as a background state, where what was missing was covered by new experiences sufficient to fill daily life, and the separation from the past became a necessary condition for maintaining a sense of normality in a reality built on the new identity. It was in this context that Nancy grew up, with a childhood not entirely complete, but sufficiently seamless to avoid triggering external suspicion, where school life, the substitute family, and the adaptation process coordinated to create a stable reality, completely detached from the old case lying dormant in storage, and that detachment continued to maintain the distance between the person now living and the past that had never been reconnected. The outward stability of childhood under the new identity did not mean everything operated perfectly, as even within that daily life structure there remained small discrepancies, mismatching signs that appeared sporadically over time, but were never clear enough on their own to form a major question, and the way they existed in isolation made them easy to overlook in an environment that prioritized normality over probing origins. Inconsistencies in personal information began to emerge as Nancy grew older and had to provide details about herself in various contexts, from education to healthcare, when basic details like place of birth, date of birth, or stories about early years were not always repeated with complete consistency. not due to intentional concealment, but because there was no clearly established original version to serve as a reference point. These inconsistencies were often minor and easily explained in each individual situation, with differences attributed to paperwork errors, recording mistakes, or inaccurate memories of the adults around her, and in a system that did not encourage cross-verification. Those explanations were sufficient to close the issue without further digging. One of the most notable gaps was the lack of newborn records, as there were no medical or administrative documents directly confirming the moment Nancy was born, and this deficiency was compensated by substitute paperwork accepted under local norms, creating a formally valid chain of records, but without clear roots. The absence of newborn records was not rare in the context of interstate movement and decentralized civil management, making it not seen as a serious warning sign, especially when not accompanied by other abnormal factors like legal disputes or formal complaints. Nancy's background thus existed in a structurally unstable state, as the origin story was maintained primarily through verbal accounts and assumptions, rather than anchored to a continuous chain of documents, and this instability did not disrupt daily life because it was covered by social relationships and the current roles she was fulfilling. The mismatching signs continued to appear at different times, such as when personal information needed updating or verification for new procedures, but each time, they were handled locally, with the focus on resolving the immediate requirement, rather than tracing deeper causes, and this localized resolution contributed to keeping the signs fragmented, never converging into a clear enough picture to trigger systemic suspicion. The signs were overlooked, not because they were completely invisible, but because they caused no immediate consequences, not hindering Nancy from continuing her studies, work or community life, and in a system prioritizing operational efficiency, anomalies that did not create disruption were often not treated as issues needing priority handling. The lack of cross-system checks played a key role in maintaining this state, as education, healthcare, and administrative databases operated independently, without sharing information in a way that allowed detection of small accumulating inconsistencies over time, and each agency only saw a portion of Nancy's person without the full picture for comparison. In that context, an individual could exist with not entirely consistent personal information without being detected by the system, as long as each separate piece of information was valid enough within its scope of use, and Nancy continued to live in that overlap, where the new identity was validated by the repeated acceptance of the surrounding social structures. The absence of cross-checks was not just a technical issue, but also reflected the management mindset of that era, when the assumption that established records were correct and did not need re-verification, unless there was clear reason prevailed, and the lack of such reason in Nancy's case made every inconsistency seen as a minor detail, not worth triggering more complex procedures. Over time, these mismatching signs became part of the background of life, existing as small but familiar deviations, not uncomfortable enough to force change, and that familiarity reduced the likelihood of anyone stopping to question the integrity of the entire story. Nancy, in her maturation process, accepted these inconsistencies as minor inconveniences rather than signs of a larger truth, as adapting to them became a necessary skill to maintain stability in her living environment, and that adaptation further reinforced not questioning origins. Those around her, from teachers to administrative staff, also contributed to sustaining this state by handling each issue separately, according to familiar procedures, without motivation or authority to connect the signs together, and that dispersed responsibility meant no one truly saw the full chain of anomalies. The consequence of this process was a self-reinforcing loop, where small inconsistencies were temporarily resolved, the lack of newborn records was accepted, the unstable background was covered by current roles, and the absence of cross-system checks ensured no strong enough convergence point to break the formed structure. Throughout this period, Nancy continued to live a life uninterrupted by the unconfirmed past, while the old case in Michigan remained dormant as a cold case, with no bridge to link it to the scattered signs appearing elsewhere. This very parallelism, where mismatching signs existed without being connected, reflected the reality that discovering the truth depended not only on whether signs existed, but also on the system's ability to recognize them as part of the same story, a capability that had not yet formed at that time. The mismatching signs scattered in Nancy's life without being connected were not the result of isolated individual indifference, but reflected a structural failure, where systems designed to manage people operated in a fragmented way and lacked the ability to self-detect deviations beyond the narrow functions of each component, starting with the lack of federal data interconnection, as each state and locality maintained separate databases for civil, education, and health matters without comprehensive cross-verification mechanisms, allowing an individual to appear legally in one place while simultaneously existing as an unresolved missing person record elsewhere. With the two entities never intersecting, this lack of interconnection was not just technical, but a consequence of the era's management thinking, when state autonomy was prioritized over the need for information sharing, and building a common database for missing children cases was not seen as a priority, especially given limited data processing technology and high implementation costs. Alongside this was the absence of systematic screening programs for children of unclear origins, as children appearing in communities with incomplete records were handled as individual cases needing immediate procedural resolution, rather than as subjects requiring long-term monitoring to ensure legality and safety, and this approach created a gap where individuals like Nancy could integrate without deep questions about origins. The lack of screening was reinforced by the assumption that families and guardians acted in the child's best interest, an assumption correct in most cases, but dangerous when applied as a general principle, without independent verification mechanisms, especially in interstate moves or sudden life changes. The legal limitations of that era further exacerbated the issue, as laws related to identification, registration, and child tracking were not designed to handle complex situations like identity changes or interstate disappearances, and deep verification requirements were only triggered in contexts of disputes or clear violations, not in outwardly stable cases like Nancy's life. These limitations not only restricted the action capacity of authorities, but also shaped how they viewed their responsibilities, as going beyond local jurisdiction to seek information elsewhere was not encouraged, and sometimes seen as overstepping, preventing anomalous signs from ever being escalated to federal coordination issues. The absence of early detection mechanisms was a direct consequence of all these factors, as there were no automated or semi-automated processes to flag cases of non-continuous personal records, no contact points between databases to identify potential matches with missing children lists, and no unified criteria to assess the risk level of an incomplete identity. In that context, the system only reacted to clear triggering events, such as legal violations, formal complaints, or third-party verification requests, while cases quietly existing in administrative gray areas continued unnoticed. Systemic errors thus did not stem from a specific wrong decision, but from the accumulation of many design choices, where each subsystem operated correctly within its function, but lacked responsibility for the overall picture, and this absence of overall responsibility allowed a case like Nancy Perez's to exist parallel to an ongoing life without any intersection. The lack of data interconnection meant law enforcement in Michigan had no way of knowing that an individual matching age and characteristics was living in another state, while agencies there had no reason or tools to cross-reference the new identity with missing lists beyond local scope, creating a closed loop of ignorance. The lack of screening for children of unclear origins meant cases like Nancy's were never placed on long-term watch lists, and the absence of early detection mechanisms meant the longer time passed, the lower the chance of connecting the pieces, as memories faded and old records were buried under layers of storage. Legal limitations also made proactively reinvestigating old records difficult, as there was no legal obligation or dedicated resources for it, and cold cases were only revisited with clear new information, something rare under conditions lacking proactive detection tools. In the overall picture, systemic failure was not missing a specific clue but failing to create an environment where clues could be identified and connected, and Nancy became a typical example of how an individual could fall into the gap between systems without any system bearing full responsibility. This failure was not personalized, impossible to attribute to one officer or specific decision, but the result of a structure built to handle standard cases but lacking flexibility to identify dangerous exceptions. For many years the system continued operating that way, addressing newly arising issues while Nancy's old case lay dormant in storage, and her life proceeded in a separate space without any signal strong enough to force the two flows to intersect. This prolonged parallelism highlighted an uncomfortable truth, that protecting children depended not only on initial investigation efforts, but also on the system's ability to track, connect and detect anomalies over time, a capability that did not exist in that period. Systemic failure was thus not a moment but a process where each small deficiency accumulated to form a large enough gap to conceal the truth for decades, and in that gap a missing child presumed dead continued to live, grow, and integrate, completely beyond the reach of the mechanisms created to search for and protect her. Systemic errors that persisted for years not only created a gap in the investigation, but also became the silent backdrop for Nancy's growth under her new identity. As time gradually transformed a child existing in an administrative gray area into an adult with a clear social position, complete with a job, responsibilities, and relationships established in the normal rhythm of life in the community where she lived. This maturation occurred naturally and continuously, with each stage following the next without any clear breaks, from completing basic education, entering the workforce, to achieving financial and personal independence, and each successful transition reinforced the sense that her life was seamless, valid, and beyond questioning. On the surface, that life had the appearance of stability, that society often sees as a sign of successful integration, with repeating daily habits, social relationships solid enough to create a sense of security, and a future planned based on the present rather than the past, giving no one reason to suspect that the person living in front of them had once been a missing child presumed dead in another state. This stability was not built on confronting or resolving the past, but on the fact that the past had never been placed at the center of her current life, with stories about her origins kept minimal, outwardly consistent, and sufficient to avoid prolonged curiosity, allowing Nancy to keep moving forward without having to revisit points with no clear answers. Over the years, the concealment of the past no longer resembled a deliberate act, but became a default state, as faint memories of the time before the new identity formed, if they still existed, were not reinforced by any external factors, and were gradually overwhelmed by the chain of new experiences, making them fragmented, lacking context, and hard to recognize as part of her personal identity. While Nancy continued to build her life, the missing person case in Michigan gradually slipped out of the system's and society's orbit of attention, as there were no new developments, no prosecuted suspects, and no additional information strong enough to revive interest, turning the file into part of administrative history rather than an issue awaiting resolution. This forgetting did not happen in a specific moment, but as a process of erosion, where each passing year without new updates reduced the likelihood of the case being mentioned in internal meetings, in the media, or in the community's collective memory, and gradually, the name Nancy Perez existed only on archived paperwork rather than in social life. For the biological family in Michigan, time carried a different meaning, as the system's forgetting did not equate to emotional closure, but instead created a prolonged pain that existed alongside ongoing life, yet was no longer nourished by hope tied to official action, widening the gap between them and the investigating agencies. Meanwhile, Nancy, under her new identity, entered adulthood with practical concerns and priorities, where decisions about work, housing, and relationships were made based on current circumstances, without reference to another family or another history. And this very independence deepened the separation between her present self and the concealed past. Generational distance began to form on multiple levels, not only between Nancy and her biological family, but also between the memory of the case and societal awareness, as those who once knew about the disappearance aged, moved away, or passed on, while new generations grew up completely unaware of the story that had once shocked the community. This generational shift further reduced the ability to connect the present to the past, as each passing year erased a portion of living memory, faded already fragile details, and made reviving the case more difficult both informationally and in terms of social motivation. In Nancy's life, generational distance manifested in her building relationships with people who had no connection whatsoever to the original story, creating a new social network where her current identity was reinforced through daily interactions and left no room for questions about distant origins. This outwardly stable life also brought psychological security, as maintaining a familiar rhythm became a higher priority than digging into uncertainties that could destabilize everything built, and that priority inadvertently prolonged the state of past concealment. The forgetting of the case at the systemic and community levels created a context where reopening the file was no longer seen as necessary or urgent, due to the absence of public pressure, new information, and proactive mechanisms for reviewing old cases, leaving the file dormant in storage, as a symbol of the limitations of a previous era. Over time, the parallel existence of a living adult and a forgotten missing victim became a stable state, where two timelines continued to flow without intersecting, each maintained by different conditions, but both protected by silence and lack of connection. For Nancy, maturing in that context meant building a personal identity, based on what was present, uninterrupted by unanswered questions, and the outward consistency of her new life allowed her to keep moving forward without looking back. For the case, time not only aged it, but changed how it was perceived, from an unsolved event to a little-mentioned part of local history, where the chance of uncovering the truth seemed to diminish with each year, not just due to lack of evidence, but because of the growing generational gap between the present and the time of occurrence. It was in this period that time was no longer a neutral factor, but became an active force, blurring the boundaries between memory and forgetting, between the living person and the frozen, and between the unknown truth and the accepted assumption, laying the groundwork for a decades-long reality, where the victim and the case continued to exist in parallel without touching, each swept along in its own separate flow. The flow of time had created enough distance for Nancy Perez's case to become part of a forgotten past, but that same time also brought fundamental changes in technology and investigative thinking, as genetic genealogy began to be applied as a new tool, not to search for evidence at a long cold crime scene, but to connect living people with files that had been frozen, opening a completely different approach from traditional methods that relied on witnesses and physical traces. This technology did not emerge as an instant solution for cold cases, but developed gradually in a society increasingly interested in tracing personal origins, as more and more people took DNA tests for reasons unrelated to criminal investigations, from wanting to understand family history to searching for distant blood ties, and that personal motivation created a massive biological database outside the direct control of law enforcement. Individuals and families taking DNA tests were usually not aiming to solve old cases, but simply seeking information about themselves. Yet each submitted DNA sample carried the potential to connect with other data, and as the number of samples grew over time, so did the likelihood of detecting unexpected biological relationships, forming an invisible network linking people who had never known of each other's existence. The incorporation of DNA data into analysis systems did not happen in a single moment, but as an accumulation process with individual samples stored, compared and updated, gradually forming databases large enough to allow identification of full or partial matches based on kinship, a capability that did not exist during the initial investigation of Nancy Perez's case. The emergence of these databases fundamentally changed the approach to cold cases, shifting the focus from searching for new clues at old scenes to reviewing stored files to see if they could be linked to living people through DNA, and this shift opened the possibility of reactivating cases once considered hopeless. For law enforcement agencies, genetic genealogy created a tool that was both powerful and challenging, as it allowed tracing backward from the biological data of people not directly involved in the case to identify connections to victims or suspects, but it also raised legal and ethical questions about privacy, scope of use, and the extent of state intervention in personal data. In that context, applying this technology to reviewing cold cases proceeded cautiously and step by step, as specialized units began re-examining old files to assess whether they met legal conditions and had the foundational data to leverage genetic genealogy, and unresolved child missing cases became a particular focus due to their potential to provide answers for both victims and families. The existence of DNA data in civilian systems, though not collected for investigative purposes, created a new layer of information that could overcome the barriers that had once deadlocked Nancy Perez's case. Since DNA does not depend on witness memory, is not affected by time in the way physical evidence degrades, and does not require an intact scene to have value. The ability to review cold cases with genetic genealogy thus not only expanded the scope of investigation, but changed its logic, where the question was no longer what happened at that time, but what biological connections exist in the present that can lead back to the past, an approach that allowed the system to see connections previously completely invisible. In Nancy's case, the new conditions for solving it did not come from finding a new witness or overlooked object, but from the quiet accumulation of DNA data in society, where each person testing inadvertently contributed to building an increasingly detailed biological map, enough to one day expose relationships hidden by identity and paperwork. This change also reflected a shift in societal thinking, as the concept of identity was no longer based solely on documents and statements, but anchored in biological data, and that shift weakened the barriers that had allowed a person to exist under a different identity, undetected for decades. Genetic genealogy was thus not just a technical tool, but a catalyst for restructuring how the system viewed old cases, as files once considered closed were placed in a new context, where time was no longer an absolute enemy, but a factor accumulating informational value. For victims' families, the emergence of this technology brought a different kind of hope, not tied to continuing a desperate search, but to the possibility that science could connect what people could not, though that hope remained fragile and dependent on factors beyond individual control. Incorporating DNA data into systems also created new demands on investigative agencies to review files, update methods, and train personnel, as effectively exploiting this technology required combining scientific expertise, legal knowledge, and investigative analysis skills, a combination not previously needed to that degree. The emergence of genetic genealogy thus marked a potential turning point for cases like Nancy Perez's, as conditions that had once made finding the truth impossible were gradually replaced by an environment where connections could be discovered indirectly through biological data, and that change created a new foundation where stories frozen in the past began to have the possibility of being questioned again in the present, not by returning to what was lost, but by looking at what exists. The new foundation created by genetic genealogy began to take effect, not through a dramatic moment, but via an anomalous result that quietly appeared in the ever-expanding data stream. When a personal DNA sample, submitted for entirely civilian purposes, unexpectedly showed a degree of similarity exceeding the normal threshold with a group of other biological profiles, a match level not sufficient to directly confirm identity, but strong enough to suggest a closer kinship than typical random connections. This result did not immediately lead to a conclusion, but first created a conflict with long-accepted assumptions, as the biological data suggested that the person carrying the sample existing in the present had a direct relationship with a missing person file that had been shifted to presumed death status, a contradiction between scientific data and administrative records that forced the system to pause and re-examine what had been considered reasonable conclusions. This contradiction could not be resolved by dismissing the DNA result as a technical error, since the match level exceeded the threshold analysts considered statistically significant, making random coincidence highly unlikely, and that raised a fundamental question about the accuracy of the presumed death record that had existed for decades. The process of establishing the biological connection proceeded cautiously, as experts began building a family tree based on available data, trying to locate the position of the sample-carrying individual within the kinship network, and step-by-step cross-referencing potential links with missing person files matching in age, timing and context. In this process, the name Nancy Perez emerged as a possibility requiring serious consideration, not because of immediate direct evidence, but because the overlap between the biological data and background information in the old file created a rare intersection between two data streams that had previously been completely separate. Placing the DNA result in the context of a cold case required coordination between departments that had rarely worked together before, as scientific data needed to be interpreted within legal and investigative frameworks, and every step had to ensure that the final conclusion was not only biologically correct, but also stood up to legal standards. Information about the anomalous match was not handled as an independent discovery, but transferred to the relevant authorities, triggering a series of internal procedures to assess reliability, scope of impact and necessary verification steps before any official action was taken. This transfer of information marked a significant shift, as the case that had lain dormant in storage began to be mentioned again in professional discussions, no longer as an outdated file but as one with potential for reopening based on new scientific data. The verification process was activated in a multi-layered manner, starting with rechecking the accuracy of the DNA result, cross-referencing with related samples, and ruling out technical errors, before expanding to reviewing administrative documents, medical records, and civilian data, to look for consistency or contradictions with the emerging new hypothesis. In this phase, the contradiction between the DNA result and the presumed death record became the focal point, forcing involved parties to question the entire chain of prior decisions that had led to the case being considered closed, and the existence of that contradiction could not be ignored if the system's integrity was to be maintained. The process of establishing the biological connection did not stop at data comparison, but also required constructing a logical narrative linking the present to the past, as experts tried to determine how an individual could have existed under a different identity for decades without detection, and that question led to re-examining previous assumptions about systemic failures. While verification steps proceeded, information was tightly controlled to avoid creating expectations or unverified speculation, reflecting the caution needed when facing the possibility of reversing a conclusion that had stood for many years, especially in a case involving a missing child and profound psychological consequences for the family. Activating the verification process did not mean the case was immediately considered solved, but rather an acknowledgement that the new data was strong enough to challenge the cold case status, opening a phase where all old information needed to be viewed in a different light, and that acknowledgement carried greater meaning than the DNA result itself, as it marked the system's willingness to self-examine previously accepted conclusions. This process also highlighted the role of genetic genealogy as a bridge between individuals and seemingly unrelated files, as a personal decision to test for private reasons inadvertently became the catalyst for reviving a forgotten case, showing how biological data could transcend geographical, temporal, and administrative barriers. In that context, the anomalous DNA result was not just a number or match ratio, but a system signal, forcing authorities to pause operational inertia and consider the possibility that a foundational assumption, specifically the presumption of Nancy Perez's death, might have been wrong. Transferring the information and activating verification also created a new chain of responsibility, as involved units had to coordinate to ensure every subsequent step was taken carefully, transparently, and evidence-based, avoiding repetition of the errors that had once deadlocked the case. In this phase, the focus was no longer on finding a perpetrator or reconstructing initial incident details, but on answering a fundamental question: whether the person recorded as missing and presumed dead was actually still alive, and if so, what that said about the entire system that had failed to recognize that existence for decades. The emergence of the contradiction between DNA data and the old file thus not only opened the possibility of resolving a specific case, but also posed a challenge to how the system handled, stored, and concluded missing person cases in the past, forcing involved parties to prepare for far-reaching consequences if the new hypothesis was confirmed. It was in this suspended state between possibility and verification that Nancy Perez's case entered a new phase, where biological data had created a crack in the wall of forgetting, and every subsequent step had to be taken with the awareness that the final outcome could completely change how the story had been told for many years, not only for the victim's family, but also for the system that had once believed the matter was concluded. The anomalous signal from the genealogical DNA results meant the case could no longer be treated as a simple frozen file, and it was precisely the contradiction between the current biological data and the past administrative conclusions that forced the system to shift from passive observation to active intervention, as the cold case unit officially took over the matter as a file requiring comprehensive re-examination. This takeover did not occur in the mindset of solving the case in the traditional way, but in the spirit of reviewing the validity of the entire chain of decisions that had led to the cold case status, starting with determining whether the file met the conditions for reopening based on modern standards of evidence and legal feasibility. The first step in the reactivation process was retrieving the archived file, a task that seemed purely procedural but in reality posed many challenges, as the documents had been created in an era of outdated technology, decentralized storage, and lack of standardization, requiring patience in assembling, organizing, and digitizing them for systematic access. The case file of Nancy Perez, which had lain dormant for many years, was pulled from storage, along with all the original investigation reports, witness statements, internal notes, and administrative decisions related to the presumed death status, forming a historical picture that reflected how the case had been perceived and handled at each point in time. Parallel to retrieving the old documents, the cold case unit proceeded to collect and compile newly emerged data from the genealogical DNA results, including scientific analyses, family tree diagrams, and information about the individual carrying the matching DNA sample, in order to place the two datasets side by side for systematic comparison. The process of comparing old and new data focused not only on finding informational matches, but also on identifying contradictions, assumptions once accepted that could now be challenged, and details overlooked in the past that might take on new meaning in light of the biological data. Investigators began re-examining the original timeline, investigative assumptions, suspect lists, and decisions to narrow the scope made in the early phase, cross-referencing them with the possibility that the victim had survived and existed under a different identity, a possibility that had not previously been prioritized. Placing this new hypothesis into the old file revealed gaps and biases that had shaped the initial investigation, as factors like the lack of evidence of violence and technological limitations had led to excluding or deprioritizing abduction scenarios. And now those decisions needed to be reassessed, not to assign blame but to understand the context that produced them. Reopening the investigative direction did not mean mechanically returning to every old detail, but rather restructuring the investigative questions as the focus shifted from finding out what happened on the day Nancy disappeared to determining the chain of events that allowed her to exist outside the system's control for decades. This new approach required combining historical analysis with modern investigative methods, as old data was re-examined with different questions, and new data was used to fill gaps previously inaccessible. Parallel to reopening the investigative direction, the cold case unit had to conduct a legal feasibility assessment of the case, a crucial step to determine the scope of lawful action given the long passage of time, limited physical evidence, and many factors potentially beyond the statute of limitations. This assessment included reviewing current statutes of limitations for crimes related to child abduction, the possibility of applying retroactive laws in certain special cases, and the extent to which DNA data could be used as court evidence if the case progressed further. Considering legal feasibility was not only to determine whether a perpetrator could be prosecuted, but also to clarify the realistic goals of the reinvestigation process, as in some cases confirming the truth and correcting the record could be more meaningful than pursuing criminal liability no longer feasible. In this process, investigators also faced practical limitations, as many original witnesses might have passed away, memories were no longer accurate, and additional documents were hard to obtain, forcing greater reliance on objective data and logical analysis rather than new statements. Reactivating the file was thus not merely reopening an old case, but an acknowledgement that new tools and perspectives could change how a story is understood, and this acknowledgement required institutional humility in revisiting conclusions once deemed reasonable within the constraints of a prior era. Within the cold case unit, taking on Nancy Perez's case also created a special motivation, as this was not just an unsolved missing person file, but a rare instance with the potential to confirm the victim was still alive, a scenario that both opened the opportunity to resolve a long-running tragedy and posed numerous ethical and legal challenges. The ongoing comparison of old and new data continued to clarify that the truth was not necessarily buried by lack of effort, but could be obscured by the limitations of tools and thinking, and reactivating the file was the necessary step to make what was once invisible become visible. In that context, reopening the investigative direction was carried out with the utmost caution, avoiding premature statements or hasty actions, because any errors at this stage would not only affect the investigation's outcome but directly impact the lives of the people involved. The legal feasibility assessment was thus not a barrier but a protective framework, ensuring the reinvestigation proceeded within permitted bounds and toward achievable goals, whether that be confirming identity, correcting the record, or if conditions allowed, advancing to further steps in the justice system. It was precisely the combination of retrieving the past and applying modern tools that moved Nancy Perez's case out of passive cold case status, placing it in a new phase where the question was no longer whether investigation could continue, but how best to use what the present could provide to illuminate a truth obscured for too long. The momentum from reactivating the file quickly transformed into a series of modern investigative actions, where the priority was no longer reconstructing hypothetical scenarios, but verifying identity using new tools and standards, starting with cross-referencing biological data against existing personal records, to determine whether the individual with the matching DNA sample could be independently confirmed as Nancy Perez. The identity verification process was implemented in multiple layers, combining DNA analysis, document checks, and evaluation of personal history consistency, to avoid any possibility of error or rushed conclusions in a case with far-reaching consequences. Investigators cross-referenced the current civil records of the suspected individual with accessible historical data, including residence registrations, educational, medical and employment records, looking for intersections or contradictions that could clarify the formation of the new identity. This cross-referencing aimed not only to confirm the individual's continuous existence over time, but also to assess the completeness and validity of the documents, identifying gaps or unusual changes that might reflect an identity change in early life. Concurrently, reviewing interstate movement, became a key investigative axis, as investigators traced movement patterns across states based on residence, school, and employment records, attempting to reconstruct the suspected individual's geographic path from childhood to adulthood, to determine whether it aligned with the possibility of being removed from Michigan in 1963. This review leveraged modern databases that allow cross-state information connectivity, a capability that did not exist during the initial investigation, and this interoperability helped reveal potential links between seemingly unrelated locations in the process. Previously overlooked points in the file were systematically re-examined, as details once deemed unimportant or unverifiable were now placed in a new context where additional data allowed them to be interpreted differently. Investigators re-examined initial assumptions that the victim could not have survived long-term outside the system's notice, comparing them with modern evidence showing a new identity could be legally maintained for decades. And this comparison highlighted biases that had previously limited the investigative scope. Reviewing overlooked points was not about finding individual fault, but identifying informational bottlenecks where a past decision or assumption had led to excluding investigative directions that might fit the current hypothesis, thereby restructuring investigative logic to be more inclusive. While identity verification and civil record cross-referencing proceeded, investigators simultaneously narrowed the scope of suspicion by eliminating possibilities no longer consistent with the new data, focusing resources on scenarios with the highest consistency across DNA, personal records, and movement paths. This narrowing was not a return to old suspect lists, but a redefinition of suspicion, as the focus shifted from seeking a perpetrator to confirming the chain of events that allowed a missing child to exist under a different identity, and thereby identifying individuals or circumstances likely involved in that process. Modern investigation also utilized data analysis tools to detect patterns not easily visible through manual methods, such as timing overlaps between administrative events, simultaneous appearances of an individual in multiple systems with inconsistent information, or data gaps aligning with key periods in Nancy's life. These analyses allowed investigators to build a more comprehensive picture, connecting disparate pieces into a logical chain, gradually reducing space for alternative hypotheses. Throughout the modern investigation, caution was paramount, as every conclusion had to be cross-verified by multiple independent sources to ensure the DNA match was not overinterpreted, and that any identity confirmation rested on converging evidence, rather than a single indicator. Civil record cross-referencing also included checking legal changes over time, determining whether documents issued in different periods complied with regulations in effect at the time, and whether there were signs of issuance in contexts of lax oversight or procedural irregularities. Interstate movement review expanded to identifying social connections that might have supported the movement and stabilization of the new identity, including family, community, or employment relationships, to better understand the social context that enabled the prolonged separation between the victim and the case. Meanwhile, reviewing old overlooked points clarified that many past decisions were not logically wrong at the time, but became incomplete under the light of modern data and tools, and this awareness allowed investigators to avoid repeating similar limitations in the current phase. Narrowing the scope of suspicion proceeded gradually, as each successful verification step removed a layer of uncertainty, moving the case closer to a verifiable conclusion, even if that conclusion did not match initial assumptions about the nature of the incident. Modern investigation was thus not merely applying new technology, but combining analytical thinking, historical understanding, and interconnected data exploitation, enabling the system to see connections once obscured by time and fragmentation. In that context, Nancy Perez's case entered a phase where the truth was no longer limited by what happened at the time of disappearance, but was pursued through traces still existing in the present, and this shift created a new investigative rhythm, where each step was shaped by converging evidence rather than its absence. As the scope of suspicion narrowed further, investigators could focus resources on confirming core elements, preparing for subsequent steps in clarifying the victim's identity and history, with the awareness that every conclusion at this stage would not only shape the fate of a file but directly affect the lives of those involved, demanding the highest level of accuracy and responsibility. The modern investigation process with its layers of cross-verification had narrowed the scope of suspicion to the necessary level to move to the decisive phase, where the goal was no longer exploring possibilities, but confirming identity, by the highest scientific and legal standards, beginning with deploying additional DNA tests to eliminate any remaining chances of error. These tests were conducted through multiple independent methods, including direct comparisons between the suspected individual's DNA sample and samples from suitable biological relatives in the file, expanding analysis to various genetic markers to increase statistical reliability, and repeating the process in different laboratories to ensure result consistency. The additional testing aimed not only to reinforce the initial match, but also to build a sufficiently robust evidentiary foundation to withstand any legal challenges, because in a case capable of reversing decades-long conclusions, the required certainty had to approach near absolute. The results obtained showed clear convergence between current biological data and the Perez family's genetic profile, with match indicators far exceeding normal confirmation thresholds, rendering the possibility of error negligible, and allowing experts to issue consistent scientific conclusions about the blood relationship. On that basis, the authorities proceeded to the next decisive step of converting the scientific conclusion into an official legal conclusion, a process requiring close coordination between DNA experts, investigative agency lawyers, and record management units, to ensure all procedural, jurisdictional, and evidentiary standards were met. The legal conclusion not only confirmed that the individual under investigation was indeed Nancy Perez, but also that the prior presumption of death was inaccurate, a statement with profound implications for how the case was recorded and handled in the system. Issuing this conclusion was done cautiously, through official documents clearly stating the scientific basis, verification chain, and comparison steps conducted, to create a transparent record open to independent review if needed. Parallel to issuing the legal conclusion, managing agencies proceeded to update the victim's record, a technical task, but one of great symbolic significance, as the name Nancy Perez was removed from the list of presumed deceased victims and reclassified as a missing victim found alive. These updates included adjusting personal information, disappearance timeline, survival status, and notes related to the identity verification process, ensuring the record accurately reflected the confirmed truth and no longer maintained old assumptions. Updating the record also required interagency coordination, as different databases needed synchronization to prevent the continued parallel existence of contradictory entities, a requirement the previous system had failed to meet. In this process, specialized units had to review all references to the case in archives, reports and information systems to ensure the status change was consistently reflected, avoiding new data discrepancies. Changing the case status from cold case to confirmed identity did not mean all questions were answered, but it marked a fundamental turning point in how the matter was viewed, as the focus shifted from prolonged uncertainty to a truth established by scientific evidence. This status change decision also triggered updates to internal classifications, allowing the case to be handled under procedures suited to the new situation, including considering next steps related to legal liability and victim support. In that context, identity confirmation was not merely a technical conclusion, but a comprehensive system adjustment to a once obscured truth, requiring involved agencies to re-evaluate how they had handled the case in the past, and how they would continue to handle it in the present. This process also imposed requirements for information management, as stakeholders had to consider the timing and manner of announcing the conclusion to ensure accuracy, avoid unnecessary harm, and respect the privacy of the newly confirmed individual, while still fulfilling the system's transparency obligations. Confirming Nancy Perez's identity simultaneously set an important precedent, showing that decades-long administrative assumptions could be overturned when new scientific data emerged, and the system had a responsibility to adapt to those changes rather than defend old conclusions for convenience. Within the investigative agency, this conclusion prompted re-evaluation of processes related to handling missing person cases, particularly the methods for changing file status and maintaining long-term review capability, to minimize the risk of repeating similar errors in the future. For this specific case, identity confirmation created a solid anchor for continuing subsequent steps, because from that point, all actions were based on an established truth, rather than a hypothesis needing verification. The case status change also held historical significance, as a file once seen as a symbol of investigative deadlock became evidence of the ability of modern technology and thinking to illuminate stories thought to be closed in the overall picture. Identity confirmation was the result of convergence between biological data, legal processes, and interagency investigative effort, and this convergence not only resolved a core question, but also opened a new chapter for the case, where the consequences of the newly confirmed truth would continue to ripple through the system and the lives of those involved, laying the foundation for subsequent steps with greater clarity and responsibility than ever before. The official confirmation of identity shifted the focus of the case from processing records to processing people, and the next decisive step was approaching Nancy Perez's birth family with the verification results, a process that required meticulous preparation both procedurally and psychologically because its consequences extended far beyond the scope of a mere investigation. The notification of results was not carried out as a simple administrative action, but was carefully planned, as authorities considered the timing, format, and participants to ensure that the information was conveyed accurately, humanely, and with minimal risk of causing unnecessary trauma to those who had lived for decades with an unresolved loss. Nancy's birth family, long accustomed to the system's prolonged silence, was approached in an entirely different context, where instead of vague updates or explanations of dead ends, they faced information capable of upending everything they had understood and accepted about their loved one's fate. The notification process was therefore conducted step by step, beginning with confirming the identity of the recipients, ensuring they had the necessary support, and were emotionally prepared before the core content was presented, reflecting the awareness that the truth, though liberating, could also be profoundly shocking. Parallel to notifying the verification results, authorities prepared for the possibility of a meeting between Nancy and her birth family, a possibility not taken as a given but carefully assessed based on the desires, psychological states, and readiness of both sides. This preparation included providing full but selective information, helping the parties understand the context, limitations, and potential outcomes, while avoiding unrealistic expectations of an immediate reunion or complete healing. The psychological impact of reconnecting the family was examined from multiple angles. As for the birth family, learning that Nancy was alive could bring relief and hope, but also reawaken long-suppressed pain, forcing them to confront what had been lost and what could never be regained. For Nancy, being informed of her biological origins and blood family posed no lesser challenge, as her personal identity had been built over decades on a different foundation, and accepting the new truth could create internal conflict between the confirmed past and the stable present. Psychological preparation for both sides thus became central, with experts mobilized to support the process, helping the parties understand that strong emotional reactions are natural, and there is no right or wrong template for how they should feel or act. Reconnecting the family was not defined simply as a meeting, but as a process where each step needed to be adjusted to the pace and readiness of those involved, with respect for personal boundaries, prioritized to avoid turning a meaningful moment into a new source of stress. In this process, authorities acted more as coordinators than directors, providing information, logistical support, and ensuring safety, but avoiding imposing a specific script for how the reunion should unfold, reflecting the recognition that this was no longer a continuation of an investigation, but a shift to a deeply human domain. The psychological impact on both sides was also considered in the context of the time that had passed, as generational gaps and differing life experiences could create mismatches in expectations, emotions, and expression, requiring patience and understanding from both parties to avoid unnecessary misunderstandings. The birth family had to face the reality that Nancy had lived a separate life, with relationships and memories not tied to them, while Nancy had to process belonging biologically to another family without shared memories, an emotional paradox, not easily resolved in a short time. Reconnecting the family was therefore not viewed as a return to the original state, but as establishing a new relationship based on the newly confirmed truth, where both sides needed to learn to understand each other in the present context, rather than trying to recreate a past that no longer existed. In the preparation steps, the parties were encouraged to clearly define their desires and boundaries, from sharing information to the degree of contact, to create a safe framework for any meeting that might occur, and minimize the risk of further harm. This notification and preparation process also imposed new responsibilities on the system, as identity confirmation was no longer the endpoint, but the starting point for a phase requiring ongoing support, ensuring that the psychological consequences of the truth were handled responsibly. Family reconnection, whatever its extent, carried meaning beyond the individual, as it raised questions about how the system should support those affected by past prolonged errors, not just by correcting records, but by accompanying them in the healing process. In that context, approaching the birth family was not merely a step in the case progression, but a test of the system's ability to shift from investigative logic to humane logic, where accuracy must be accompanied by empathy. The manner of notifying results, preparing for the meeting, and supporting the psychological impact on both sides, thus became key factors shaping the experience of all involved. And how these steps were carried out would have long-term effects on whether and how the birth family and Nancy could reconnect. Throughout this process, caution was not intended to slow progress, but to ensure that every action respected the complexity of human emotions, acknowledging that there is no perfect solution for a decades-long tragedy, only better or worse choices. Approaching the birth family was thus carried out as a series of considered decisions, where the goal was not to create a symbolic moment for the public, but to build conditions for an authentic, albeit fragile, connection between people separated by time, circumstances, and systemic limitations. And this very caution reflected the recognition that sometimes, the hardest part of a case lies not in uncovering the truth, but in living with that truth responsibly. The cautious preparatory steps in approaching the birth family led to the inevitable moment when the meeting after decades was arranged, a moment that bore no resemblance to a simple homecoming, but rather the intersection of two lives that had diverged too long to merge immediately. The meeting took place in a tightly controlled setting to ensure emotional safety for all involved. But no matter how thoroughly prepared, the reality of direct confrontation still carried a weight that no script could fully lighten. Nancy entered that space with an identity shaped by decades living under a different name, while the birth family faced an adult, rather than the image of the 10-year-old child frozen in their memories from 1963. And this very discrepancy created an initial silence, where every glance, gesture, and word had to navigate through thick layers of time. Differences in life experiences quickly surfaced as seemingly minor details became evidence of two parallel realities that had existed too long, from the way Nancy spoke about her work, home, and current relationships to the way the birth family recalled old memories with a familiarity that Nancy could not share, creating a communication space where empathy had to be built rather than assumed. The time gap was measured not just in years, but in differing life experiences, as each side brought their own stories, traumas, and adaptations, and placing them side by side in a single meeting, revealed that reunion was not restoring the original state, but confronting a new reality that had never existed before. For the birth family, seeing Nancy alive brought profound relief and emotion, but it also reawakened pain over the lost years, the holidays, milestones, and moments they had endured in her absence, and the coexistence of joy and regret created a complex emotional state, difficult to fully express. For Nancy, the meeting posed no lesser challenge, as she had to reconcile the newly confirmed biological truth with the stable life she had built, facing a blood family with no shared memories, and that unfamiliarity did not deny the meaning of the connection, but made it fragile and in need of time to take shape. In the reunion space, stories were shared not in a clear order, but interwoven between present and past, as the birth family tried to fill the void with memories, while Nancy listened with curiosity mixed with distance, and this difference in approaching the past reflected the reality that each side had learned to live without the other in very different ways. The post-reunion reality began to emerge in the very first moments, as surging emotions gradually gave way to practical questions about how this relationship would exist in daily life, not as a story with a happy ending, but as a process requiring ongoing negotiation. The time gap could not be erased by biological recognition, and accepting that became a crucial step to avoid unrealistic expectations, as both sides had to acknowledge they could not return to 1963 to start over, but could only build a form of connection suited to the present. Life differences were evident when Nancy's values, habits, and worldview, formed in a different environment, did not always align with the birth family's expectations, and recognizing these differences was not to create new distance, but to lay the foundation for mutual respect. In that context, reunion was not seen as the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new phase, where every interaction needed to be adjusted to each person's pace and boundaries, avoiding pressure for immediate bonding. The post-reunion reality also included facing conflicting emotions that arose after the meeting, as initial excitement could give way to confusion, exhaustion, or even disorientation, and acknowledging these reactions as a natural part of the process helped ease the psychological burden on those involved. In the days and weeks that followed, the connection was maintained in small, cautious ways, through conversations, information exchanges, and selective presence in each other's lives, reflecting the awareness that this relationship needed time to develop if it was to endure. The time gap continued to exist as an undeniable factor, but rather than being seen as an absolute barrier, it was gradually viewed as the context in which all connection efforts must be placed, allowing the parties to adjust expectations and accept that familiarity would not come from shared memories, but from new experiences created in the present. Life differences, if approached with openness, became opportunities for deeper understanding, as each side learned to listen to the other's story without imposing their own frame of reference, and that very listening helped reduce the initial sense of strangeness. The post-reunion reality was thus not a perfect picture, but a series of moments, interwoven with hope and caution, where each small step forward held more meaning than grand symbolic gestures. Throughout this process, reunion was understood not as the closure of a tragedy, but as the opening of a new unprecedented relationship, where both sides had to learn to coexist with the newly confirmed truth, without letting it overwhelm their current lives. Accepting that the time gap would always exist allowed the birth family and Nancy to approach this relationship with the necessary humility, reducing pressure to compensate for lost years and focusing on what could be built from this point forward. Reunion in that context was not measured by immediate harmony, but by the ability to maintain respect, patience, and willingness to adjust, factors that would determine whether this connection could grow over time. It was the way the parties faced the post-reunion reality, acknowledged life differences, and accepted the time gap that shaped the true meaning of the meeting, transforming it from an emotional moment into a living process where the truth was not only recognized, but integrated into life in a more humane and sustainable way. The reunion after decades brought confirmation of Nancy Perez's fate, but simultaneously highlighted an unavoidable reality that finding the victim did not equate to fully clarifying the entire case, as the central question of the perpetrator and the mechanism of the 1963 abduction remained unanswered conclusively. In reviewing the files from a modern perspective, investigators had to acknowledge that the identity of the person or persons directly responsible for removing Nancy from Michigan had never been definitively established, and the initial hypotheses considered in the early investigation phase lacked sufficient basis to become conclusions, especially as they were built in a context lacking physical evidence and relying heavily on inference. The failure to identify the perpetrator did not stem from lack of effort, but from the accumulation of multiple adverse factors over time, as witnesses who had provided vague or indirect information in the initial days after the disappearance were now gone, or if still alive, their memories had faded to the point of being unreliable. Losing a data source that was already fragile, the absence of witnesses was not just a personal issue, but a natural consequence of the more than 4-decade time span, as those present in the 1963 context gradually left social life, taking with them memory fragments never fully documented. Concurrently, the physical evidence related to the abduction, already very limited from the start, continued to deteriorate, or no longer existed, as the scene was not preserved to modern standards. Items were not retained long-term, and many documents existed only as cursory notes, making event reconstruction nearly impossible. The erosion of evidence was not just material loss but loss of context, as small details that might have been significant could no longer be placed in their original environment for accurate interpretation. In assessing prosecution potential, authorities faced severe legal limitations, as statutes of limitations had expired for some related charges, and even in cases not bound by limitations, the lack of direct evidence made meeting courtroom proof standards very low. Lawyers and investigators alike recognized that bringing a case to trial required not just reasonable suspicion, but a strong chain of evidence to convince the justice system, a requirement difficult to meet in a context where evidence had been eroded by time. Legal prosecution limits were thus not just technical barriers, but reflections of reality, that criminal justice operates within certain time frames and standards, and when those are exceeded, the ability to pursue accountability narrows significantly, even if part of the truth has been confirmed. In Nancy Perez's case, confirming the victim was alive brought important record and humanitarian adjustments, but it did not automatically generate new data on the perpetrator's identity, as the two processes, though related, did not parallel in terms of evidence. Investigators continued reviewing old hypotheses in new light, searching whether Nancy's existence under a different identity might suggest a specific abduction pattern or support network, but all inferences remained hypothetical without specific evidence to confirm. The inability to identify the perpetrator also raised questions about the extent to which the system could and should continue pursuing the case, as each additional investigative step had to be weighed between potential value and resource costs, especially as the likelihood of a clear legal conclusion grew lower. For the birth family, the truth that Nancy was alive brought deep comfort, but did not fully erase the need to understand what happened and who was responsible, creating a mixed emotional state of relief and incompleteness, as their story had one chapter rewritten but no complete ending. For Nancy, the unsolved abduction meant part of her past remained beyond understanding, as questions about how and why she was removed from her birth family lacked official answers, forcing her to accept a degree of uncertainty as part of her personal history. In that context, The case was viewed as unresolved, not due to lack of conclusion on the victim's fate, but due to lack of conclusion on criminal responsibility, an important distinction reflecting the complexity of cases spanning decades. Authorities maintained the file technically open, allowing receipt and evaluation of any new information that might emerge in the future, though that possibility was realistically viewed as very low. Keeping the case unresolved also carried symbolic meaning, acknowledging that justice is not just closing files, but avoiding hasty declarations of finality when core questions remain unanswered. In internal assessments, Nancy Perez's case was seen as an illustration of how time can shift the focus of justice from pursuing perpetrators to confirming truth and minimizing harm to those involved, though that does not replace the need for accountability. The existence of legal limits and eroded evidence did not diminish the significance of reopening and confirming identity, but it emphasized that each investigative phase is governed by specific historical conditions, and what can be achieved in the present does not always align with the desires of those involved in the overall picture. The unsolved abduction became the unfilled part of the story, a void reminding that not every tragedy can be fully closed within legal frameworks, especially when time has taken away the elements necessary for pursuing responsibility. That very void shaped how the case is remembered, not as a story with a clear ending, but as a journey where truth is illuminated piece by piece, and accepting that the perpetrator may never be identified became part of facing reality. The case thus continued to exist in a suspended state, no longer a traditional cold case, but not yet fully closed, reflecting the limits of the justice system when facing stories spanning generations, where justice, memory, and time do not always converge at the same point. The fact that Nancy Perez's abduction remained unresolved in terms of criminal responsibility did not diminish the profound meaning left by the entire journey, as that very incompleteness forced the system, community, and investigators to reflect on what happened, not just as an isolated case but as a comprehensive lesson on how child disappearances are approached, handled, and remembered over time. The first and clearest investigative lesson lay in recognizing the limits of initial assumptions, as the case showed how era-specific biases, though arising from reasonable context, could shape investigative direction in ways that excluded important possibilities, and failing to prioritize the abduction scenario early on contributed to pushing the case into prolonged deadlock. From this, the case emphasized the importance of maintaining an open mindset in investigations, where hypotheses need continuous re-evaluation as conditions change, rather than being fixed as implicit conclusions simply due to lack of contradicting evidence at a given moment. The role of DNA in reactivating and clarifying the case also became a significant legacy, not only because it confirmed the victim's identity, but because it illustrated how biotechnology could overcome barriers once created by time, geography, and administrative fragmentation, opening a new approach for cold cases previously seen as unprogressible. Genetic genealogy in this context was not a magic solution to all problems, but a tool changing investigative logic, shifting focus from seeking lost evidence to connecting living people to the past through biological data, an approach requiring ethical caution, but offering great potential. The social impact of Nancy Perez's case thus extended beyond the family and local community, contributing to broader discussions on privacy, DNA data use, and state responsibility in balancing individual protection with justice pursuit, questions growing increasingly urgent in the big data era. Simultaneously, this story highlighted the psychological and social impact of prolonged disappearances, not only on victims' families, but on the victims themselves when found after decades, emphasizing that resolving a case does not end with confirming truth, but extends to supporting people in living with that truth. The value of record preservation became another key highlight, as the case showed that even if initial documents were flawed, their preservation enough to allow future review created the condition for truth confirmation when suitable tools emerged, and if those records had been destroyed or lost, the opportunity might have been forever gone. From this perspective, record preservation was not just an administrative duty, but an ethical act, reflecting the system's commitment to error correction and learning from the past, even if only feasible after decades. The case also clarified that preservation must be accompanied by access and review capability, as a preserved but never revisited record risks becoming a symbol of forgetting, rather than a resource for justice. The meaning of Nancy Perez's story for other disappearances lay in providing a precedent, showing that administrative conclusions like presumed death should not be absolute endpoints, and maintaining the ability to reopen files when conditions change is necessary to avoid the system closing itself to untested possibilities. For families living with the uncertainty of a missing loved one, the case offered a form of cautious hope, not a promise that every story will have a happy ending, but proof that time does not necessarily mean the end of opportunities to uncover truth. Simultaneously, this story reminded that such hope needs responsible management, avoiding unrealistic expectations and respecting that each case has its own evidence and legal limits. At the system level, the case's legacy pushed for reviewing how law enforcement agencies coordinate federally shared data and use new technology, emphasizing that gaps once allowing a victim to exist unidentified for decades should not persist in the modern context. The case also raised questions about societal responsibility in detecting and protecting children of unclear origins, showing that passive acceptance of small anomalies can accumulate into major failures without proper checking and intervention mechanisms. From a humane perspective, Nancy Perez's story emphasized that a case's most important legacy lies not only in identifying perpetrators or not, but in how the system and society treat those affected. From acknowledging errors to supporting them in healing, the reunion, though imperfect, became evidence of human adaptability and the search for connection, even after prolonged disruptions, and that very adaptability added depth to the concept of justice beyond legal frameworks. In the overall picture, Nancy Perez's case left a multi-layered legacy, both a warning about investigative limits in specific historical contexts, and proof of technology's and persistence power in illuminating truth, albeit belatedly. This legacy does not require the system to promise unattainable results, but to maintain self-examination, learning, and adaptation capability, acknowledging that justice is a process that can span generations. For other disappearances, this story serves as a reference frame, reminding that every file represents a person and a network of relationships, and continuing to preserve, review, and update those files is a form of respecting life and memory. Ultimately, the greatest meaning of the case lies not in whether it was fully closed but in how it changed our understanding of seeking truth in imperfect conditions, affirming that while time may take away evidence and witnesses, it can also bring new tools, and society's responsibility is to be ready to use those tools to revisit the past with the necessary honesty, humility, and humanity. Nancy Perez's story reminds Americans today that safety is sometimes just a collective belief, like in Michigan in 1963 when children could walk a short distance alone and adults assumed everything would be fine. In the early part, a small unusual detail appeared, but the witness doubted, hesitated, and reassured themselves, while the family searched informally before calling police. The practical lesson is treat those small signals as data requiring action, not fleeting feelings. If you see a stranger approaching a child in a way that makes you uncomfortable, note the description, license plate, direction of travel, and call 911 early. The initial delay in the story cost the golden hour advantage, and caused the scene to be contaminated, the timeline to blur, statements to conflict, and the investigation to fall into wrong assumptions. In America today, we have Amber Alert cameras, phone data, but those are only useful if initial information is fast and specific enough. The second lesson involves DNA. The case only came back to life when genetic genealogy data revealed a contradiction with the presumed death record. Therefore, families with missing persons should proactively preserve medical records, photos, fingerprints, if available, and consider providing DNA samples to authorities per local guidelines. Finally, the reunion shows that being found does not mean the end. Life differences and time gaps are real. The advice is to prioritize post-reunion support, psychological counseling, contact boundaries, and patience, so the new truth does not become another trauma. If you believe every missing persons file deserves another chance to be reopened, subscribe to the channel so we can continue following those cold cases that seem forgotten, but still hold hope. Thank you for staying until the end of Nancy Perez's story, and see you in the next video, where we will keep seeking truth for the names that have not yet returned home.